around here somewhere.
Both of you. Oh, poor guy. Now he doesn't have a seat.
Oh, yeah, I'll grab one.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and the mics, the buttons, just press them and it'll show green and he's on.
And I think Kevin was going to.
I have an address. Oh, I gave it to her. That's okay. Welcome, everyone. I'm Gail Sassnett, Associate Director of the Bob Graham Center for Public Programs. And what a great audience. So nice to see all of you here tonight. And I know you're in for a real treat tonight, having both of these experts with us for the aftermath of the elections that still haven't been called, right? Dr. Susan MacManus is Distinguished Professor Emerita of Public Administration and Political Science from USF, and she is the most quoted political analyst in the state. She has co-authored numerous books, articles, served as chair of the Florida Elections Commission, was a Fulbright research scholar, among many, many other accomplishments in her long and distinguished career. Professor Dan Smith is currently chair of the Department of Political Science here at UF. He is known for his knowledge of voting behaviors, and he's also published numerous books and articles, and also has a very long list of accomplishments. After the talk, there will be time for Q&A, and we ask that you come to the microphone, which we will put here in the middle, and to ask your questions, because we are streaming and recording this. And I'll remind you to please turn off your cell phones. And now I will turn it over to you.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Anybody following the recounts? It's really a pleasure to be here, and I'm going to give a whirlwind tour through Florida, and then the expert on voting will follow me. So we have sort of coordinated this a little bit. I always start with where we started at the beginning of this year, what everyone was anticipating, the great blue tsunami, and some of the truisms about politics, that the out party that's more energized when they win the popular vote is much more engaged, and we certainly saw that with Democrats early on. And the president's party almost always loses seats, as it turns out he did. And Democrats saw the possibility of winning back control of U.S. Senate and the House, and Florida actually was key to both. That's why both our U.S. Senate and our governor's race were really very, very closely watched, with it 6 congressional districts. And, of course, Democrats wanting to reverse the long slide downward in terms of governorships over the years, and they did pick up some there. But I think looking at this gives us a feel for what from day one was so interesting to so many people across the country, because just about every political phenomenon is observable in our great state. And certainly greater clout in national politics, because we were key to the control of both houses of Congress. More women and minorities running for all kinds of offices up and down the ballot. Some of you may have seen, we did a study. 122 women ran for the Florida State Legislature this year, many women of color. Activism on the upswing on campuses. We've come full circle. I hate to say it, I graduated from FSU. I say that or not, but anyway, 1968, and I had to do a little talk about at our reunion this year, and it occurred to me, activism was rampant and really wild on college campuses, and now it's come full circle because really most of the interesting political activism is occurring on Florida's college campuses. And then, of course, identity politics, and what I'd like to leave a lot of you here today is a better understanding of our age makeup of our state. But in May of this year, I was asked to make a presentation to Florida's election officials, the Florida State Association of Supervisors of Elections. And this is the slide that I gave to them of things that they could expect in this election cycle. And of course, when they saw it, they said, oh, but it was pretty obvious even then that we were going to have an election to behold, and it was going to be very close and heavily watched by the entire nation. And particularly, we knew from the get-go that we were going to have a lot of close elections. We were already seeing in some local places with flipping coins for local offices that were tied. And so when you have that kind of closeness in the positions that we have that are critical nationally, and the rest is history, and we're not finished yet. Again, most of you have already seen this. You know that we're the 1% state that just about the last 4 elections, two governors, 2 presidential, the margin of victory has been a sheer 1%. Little did we know this time it would be 0.5%. But it is the case that Florida is competitive. We also knew from the beginning that the Senate race was considered a toss-up. The very first kind of projections by people like Larry Sabato rated our Senate race a toss-up, as they did our governor's race. And of course, both of these predictions turned out to be right on the money. What was forgotten, the poor candidates running for the cabinet, critically important positions in our state, couldn't get a breath, certainly couldn't get much news coverage. As it turns out, to the top 2, the AG and the CFO went to the Republicans. The Commissioner of Agriculture is a recount, but it looks like the Democrat might prevail, which means it'll be the first time in a long while we've had at least one Democrat in a cabinet post. These were the numbers before and after the election. You can see here that Florida Senate, Democrats thought they could pick up at least 5 seats. They may win, and it looks like they will win, the Cruz-Young Senate seat, which is in the Tampa area. So it's either going to be 23 R's and 17 D's or 24 R's and 16 D's. So there wasn't the pickup there that was anticipated. The Florida House, again, now we know that Democrats have done quite well here, and there's 2 that are outstanding recounts, and both of those currently are held by Republicans, but one of those recounts is in a Democratic area, and the difference is only 36 votes. And the congressional delegation is really a big story about the national connection, because you see now it's almost tied in terms of our congressional delegation in Washington, 14 R's and 13 D's. So this is, if you're a Democrat, you really like these numbers. This gives a feel of where the vote was, the most intense. The darker colors show a wider margin, and the lighter colors show very evenly divided. But obviously, Southeast Florida, Democrat, Southwest Florida, Republican. The suburban areas everywhere, more Republican. The metro areas, more Democrat. And so this is why you've seen a lot of accounts of this election saying that the new divides are geographical, the metro versus the suburban and rural, and that's what you get in terms of the divide, and a lot of that has to do with who lives there. But I just want to give you a quick look at who Florida's voters are. This would have been book closing data at who is actually registered, and to show you this trend that's bothering both parties, the fact that the fastest growing group is the no party affiliation, 28%, 27% actually NPA, and 1% minor, which is mostly libertarians. We have a very diverse electorate. Over 1/4 of our registered voters are not white. But interesting here in this slide, even between the primary and the general election, Hispanics picked up another 1%. A lot of that was the emphasis on the Puerto Ricans in the Osceola County and Orange County and the I-4 corridor. It's interesting here you see the racial differences, the more diverse Democratic Party versus the largely white Republicans, with Hispanics being second and the NPAs in between. But the age diversity, quite interesting, and I know that Dan will probably talk a little bit about this. This is a traditional way of looking at age, but it is true that 46% of our registered voters are young. I, however, prefer to look at it generationally. I think this is a better way of understanding politics and the issues that move people. And you'll see here, let's just see a show of hands. Do we have anybody from the greatest generation, 91 or older, here tonight? I actually had one the other day, so. Silent generation, 73 to 90. Okay, look at here. How about boomers, 54 to 72? Generation X, 38 to 53. Millennials, 23 to 37. And how about some Gen Zers, the hashtaggers? Here we go. I just point out two things, because long gone are the days the baby boomers are the biggest generation, and the issues and the experiences there are very different from younger ones. And you can certainly see, I always point to the one about the hashtag generations with guns being a huge issue there from their experiences, more than for some other generations. And the millennials are what we call the environmental generation. So I think this is a better way of understanding politics, is to look at shared experiences generationally. And if you look at this graphic, it shows that the three youngest generations in Florida are 53% of our registered voters. It's no longer the state where it's only elderly that matter. It's increasingly, now obviously they might not have come to their potential in their turnout, but the bottom line is that it's a changing day. And the real, I think, lesson of this election, in a way, demographically, is a passing to the younger generations. You're seeing a generational transformation in Florida politics. It's also interesting that the three youngest generations are very racially and ethnically diverse. If you look at registered Generation Z, you'll see that a majority are non-white. So you really clearly see sort of a racial divide between the three oldest and the three youngest generations. And certainly younger people are more prone to register as no party affiliation, and that's only going to escalate. Women are a majority of our electorate. I point to the unknown gender there. That's increasingly redefined. Certain states have already redefined and offered other options to gender, such as transgenders and so forth. We will probably start to see some of that activism regarding gender definitions in our state. Women are by far a larger share of Florida Democrats than men, 20% more. You see there, how many of you realize that? Okay, and Republicans evenly divided, as NPAs are as well. Here's where our voters live. Almost half live in the famous I-4 corridor, the Tampa and Orlando media markets, 45%. It was in the 2016 election that Orlando surpassed Miami as the second largest media market in terms of registered voters. This is how Florida's ideological makeup looks according to some surveys by Gallup. The fastest growing ideological group is liberal, and that's obviously in large part driven by the rise of the younger voters. The key base constituencies this past election for Democrats, I don't think any of you are terribly surprised by these. Minorities, women, millennials, the age and younger generations, LGBTQ community, teachers unions and public employees unions, and Jewish voters. 2/3 of Florida Democrats live in the top three markets there, with the largest being the Miami-Fort Lauderdale, which of course is the epicenter of the recount battle at the moment. Democrat big issues, again, most of you know these, but of course one of the really big looming ones is the one at the bottom. In terms of Republicans in Florida, here you get the rural-urban kind of split, the age differences. You begin to understand why we have this almost even divide between Democrats and Republicans. Rural voters who are older, and Republicans are older. Hispanics, notice both groups aimed at Puerto Ricans. The suburban voters, especially women, a big look Democrats really thought they could flip a lot of these this time over issues like guns, and it turned out to be a little mixed because some of the suburban women ended up going back Republican because of the Kavanaugh hearings. Gun owners and so forth and so down the way. The I-4 corridor is home to most of Florida's, almost half of Florida's Republicans, followed by Miami and Jacksonville. The big issues this time were the economy, socialism, school choice, Second Amendment, border security, religious freedom, and the environment. Why does socialism not work well in trying to attract younger voters? Because surveys show most younger voters can't define what socialism means. But it is very powerful we saw it was very powerful within Nicaraguan, Colombian, Venezuelan, and Cuban voters in South Florida. But one of the big challenges we've had from the get-go, it's one that candidates and parties have struggled mightily with, is this whole problem with people not believing the news media or believing only that which they watch or listen to or etc. So we see that there is a pretty widespread view that people do not think America's media at the moment is particularly objective. But more importantly, and sadly, is that last one, that a majority can't even name a source that they say reports the news objectively. This is not good for our country. I know that you all know that. But this was the lay of the land, and it made campaigning and getting people's messages through very, very difficult. But competition does yield interest, and you'll see that we actually had an increase in turnout in the primary. And we also saw a pretty hefty increase, and actually now the latest statistic is 63% turnout in this general election. Now, I'm going to sort of end with taking a look here. One of the reasons that it's hard to really predict Florida or any other state, but especially ours, is the news media. Issues and events happen that saturate people's thinking, and to the point of where you think nothing else can matter by the time November the 6th came along. So I started and I went back to August and look at the big issues there. And you can see at the time no one thought anything other than the Confederate monuments or white supremacy would be the dominant issue by November 6th of 2018. Then I skipped to 2018, and you see here women's marches, followed by Parkland, followed by the whole separation of kids from parents at the borders, followed by the algae bloom and red tide, all of these very, very powerful hashtag movements, most of which had their anchor here in Florida, but ended up being consequential in national politics and national races. But here is something that drives home a little bit why Republican turnout it spiked a little bit as we neared the end of the election. For example, in September, you had the Kavanaugh hearings begin. September 22nd, the overseas ballots were mailed out. That would be to military personnel and overseas personnel like embassy people and business people and students and academics and stuff overseas. Between October 2nd and 9th, and the Kavanaugh confirmation was still ongoing here, the vote by mail ballots were sent out. And a lot of people just want to get it behind. You probably didn't see the ads that we saw in Tampa, but so you know, $250 million was spent on TV ads in Florida this year. And we couldn't even breathe without seeing them on our television. Then the hurricane, then the caravan, which of course caught Republicans' attention, that right on the heels of the confirmation battle. Then the bombs packages to National Democrats, which ramped up Democrat interest. And then you had in-person early voting starting October 27th, followed by the shootings in Pittsburgh. But then October 31, Trump rally in Fort Myers, which was an area where Republican interest was lagging a bit because that was home to one of the biggest algae blooms, and you had Republicans thinking of just passing it by, not necessarily voting for a Democrat. He ramped up turnout, followed by his appearance in Pensacola. And so my point here on all of this is, and on election day, which more Republicans vote on election day than Democrats, it shows that issues that really affect somebody can be, how you vote, depending on when you vote, can be heavily driven by what's in the news and what you think is very important to you. Now, in terms of things that we were really surprised about, the predictions of turnout and margin of victory were both off. They were both higher in the case of turnout, and margin of victory only half to a quarter, depending on the road. Another recount controversy. How many of you remember the 2001 well? Did we ever want to see another one? No, but guess what? And now we have it on 3 statewide races. No one ever thought such a thing would happen. And then election night, people learned what many of you in here, you're informed, know, is that the totals on election night exclude 3 big groups of voters. Ones whose mail ballots arrived in a supervisor's office by 7 o'clock that night. They can't be opened on election day. There's too much chaos. They have to have their names checked, the signatures checked, the verification. That doesn't happen election night. Nor does the resolution of all of the provisional ballots that were cast either in early voting or election night. And third, you realize that the overseas ballots are not even due until Friday of this week, and the recount is on Thursday. So people do a disservice, the news media in particular, of trying to project this idea, well, the numbers change, there must be a conspiracy or whatever else, without informing people that we have these 3 groups of people that aren't counted. And who believed that yes, out of 11 of the 12 amendments, when virtually every newspaper in the state advised against it? I'm convinced that people, all they did was basically read the ballot title, and it looks really swell. Voter control of gambling, end dog racing, put more things on lobbyists. That got the most votes, by the way. On down the line. And the only one that didn't pass came close, but it's the one that was the most confusingly worded, the one on homestead exemption stuff. And again, all 19 countywide tax and bond referendums passed, including the 2 you had here. Record, and nobody believed that was possible, with every ad talking about raising taxes or lowering taxes. And yet people felt like their pocketbooks were pretty good. And in a lot of places, they voted on transportation bonds in places where it took them 3 hours to get to work in the morning. But this was very unusual. All these are surprises. Polls were terrible for a lot of different reasons, and they create a storyline that can be very erroneous and can tamp down turnout on election day. I want to see, and I was interested in what Dan would say about it, I would love to see pollsters who report the response rates by parties in their surveys, because we know that Republicans are less likely to answer a poll than Democrats. In rural areas, you can't reach them. And then the privacy. All right, how many of you got a text on your phone urging you to vote or vote for someone? This is freaking out a lot of older Americans who are suddenly realizing that people know a lot about them. I think privacy is going to be the next big issue, actually, in America. And polls can't ever predict turnout or late surges. So these things really didn't change at all. Lower turnout, but still higher. Certain groups difficult to get. Republicans turn out at higher rates than Democrats, especially on election day. Florida voters do tend to vote yes, and yes, we do have close elections or recounts. So looking ahead, here's what I'm predicting. 2020, close again. Thank you.
Well, it's always great following Susan, because she provides this nice lay of the land. And let's see if I can pull up my slides here. All right. Yeah, simpler times. Times here. I know Susan would also like to thank David Colburn and Gail Sassnet for their incredible service here in the Graham Center, and hopefully we will be able to continue this 2 years in the future under a new leadership. But it's great to be here and talk a little bit about my take on this election that is not yet complete here in Florida. And right up to my mouth. Okay, there you go. There was a lot of talk about this blue wave coming into this election, about the enthusiasm of Democrats and progressives, from the Black Lives Matter to the Me Too movement to the Parkland Strong, March for Our Lives, to the teacher strikes going on and looking at frustrations over public education funding, to DACA, to the Muslim ban. All of these were projected to increase turnout. And indeed, as Dr. MacManus said, it did prove true. Our colleague Michael McDonald here in the Political Science Department does the official, unofficial turnout rates for the country. And he's been doing them for now 20 years, and we had higher midterm turnout this year all the way back to 1914. And so we're looking at around 60 some odd percent upwards. But he generates those, and even the federal government uses those statistics that he generates every night. So there was a lot of enthusiasm. Yet, when you actually break down the electorate, it was very different across the states. And Florida, in many ways, was an outlier with respect to a portion of the electorate that might fall into those various categories that I just played out there. And so, while I believe everything that Susan has said, I would caution and say that destiny is not driven only by these demographic shifts. We have some other things going on in Florida that lead to potentially a red tide that has led to the apparent victories of Republicans running for U.S. Senate, for governor, although those are still in question. And I think they should be in question. I'm going to raise some issues on that. This red tide is not only with respect to the energy that Donald Trump ginned up in the end of the campaign coming down to Florida. We saw it in places like Sumter County, where 85% of registered Republicans turned out to vote. I can tell you if half that percentage of 18 to 29-year-olds had turned out to vote, we would be looking at a full blue wave in this state. All right, so just put that in some perspective. If we had anywhere close to 50% of 18 to 29-year-olds, we wouldn't be in recount. But that didn't happen. All right? And there are a lot of reasons for that, even though the demographics are shifting, and even though we're seeing it in places like Texas, in Georgia, where even though they weren't blue, they're progressing in that direction. The same should be happening here, but there's some factors that are not. I'll get to that. The other part of the red tide is obviously all this concern over voter suppression. And I take a more nuanced view than voter suppression in the country or in Florida. And I think it'd be better to, rather than screaming voter fraud or voter suppression, that we find a more balanced, nuanced language that can discuss what's going on. But certainly 2013 was momentous with respect to the Shelby decision in the Supreme Court eviscerating Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act by taking out the coverage of these states that are covered by red, as well as these 5 counties in Florida that actually were added to the coverage of the Voting Rights Act in 1975, not the 1965 original act. And that was largely over Hispanic voting suppression that was going on in this state, down in Monroe County, Collier, Hendry, Hardy, and Hillsborough. That's all gone. And as a result, there's no more pre-clearance of the federal government or federal judges on any changes to voting laws. And so Florida, because we had 5 counties and because we're supposed to have uniform voting laws, anytime that the state would change its laws, the federal government got involved with the Justice Department in terms of making sure that they were not going to have any disparate effects on racial or ethnic minorities who are covered under the Voting Rights Act. That's now gone, but I want to, again, qualify what's going on in Florida after talking about some of the things that have gone on. We have all been hearing about list maintenance and citizenship requirements. This is Secretary of State Chris Kobach, who was Secretary of State running for governor in Kansas and actually lost in a very Republican state, largely because he overplayed his hand in terms of talking about the voter fraud that was going on, and he couldn't find any, about lying under oath and being censured by the federal court. Surprisingly, he lost, even though he was counting the votes in Kansas. That's not the case with Brian Kemp, Secretary of State of Georgia, running for governor, who was also counting the votes, and after the votes were tallied, then he stepped down and handed over the reins to one of his deputies. But that's obviously being challenged in federal court as well, the results. But what Brian Kemp was doing, first on his own and then with the support of the Republican-controlled legislature in Georgia, was requiring an exact match for your name in order to register to vote when lining those up with DMV records or Social Security records. So Daniel A. Smith, if I put that down on my voter registration as opposed to Daniel Arthur Smith that's on my driver's license, I would be flagged, or not. 75% of the people who were being flagged were African American. Is that because they had unique names, perhaps? Was there other type of issues? Courts have intervened several times with litigation and have overturned that. But one of the issues in Georgia is, were the 50,000 plus people whose registrations were in suspense able to actually vote a regular ballot on election day as the courts had charged, or did that actually get conveyed down to the local clerks who are doing this? So this is one of the legal challenges that's going on currently in Georgia. Purging infrequent voters. This was in front of the U.S. Supreme Court. I'm actually in that picture because I was the expert in Ohio for challenging Ohio's effort to purge voters who didn't vote didn't vote in 2 years, didn't respond to a regular postcard, and didn't vote in 2 more general elections. The lead plaintiff in this was a gentleman, Republican, white, from eastern Ohio who had lived in the same place for years and years since '75, voted in 2008, didn't vote in 2010, didn't respond to a postcard even though he was paying taxes to the same jurisdiction that was regulating the voting, didn't vote in 2012, didn't vote in 2014, and then came out to vote in the 2015 election where they had a statewide medical marijuana measure, and he voted against it. He wanted to vote against it and was not on the rolls. So he was one of the lead plaintiffs in the ACLU Demos case, which the oral arguments were pretty amazing, but my side lost in terms of challenging that law 5-4 before the Supreme Court. And so as a result, any state now can do a supplemental purge just because you haven't voted. And the analogy I like to use is, if I'm a gun owner, do I have to discharge my weapon every 2 years in order to keep my weapon? Or is the government going to come in and take it away? Well, that, of course, would require you to actually register your weapons, which is never going to happen except for maybe concealed weapons. So there's some issues there in terms of, do you have a right not to vote? Other type of things, purging non-citizens. Florida tried to do that in 2012 by purging potential non-citizens, first 180,000 and then 2,625 individuals that the Secretary of State identified through a failed match process and tell supervised elections, you have to purge these people if they don't provide proof of citizenship. And I was involved in that litigation as well as their expert, and we won in federal court, and all those people were put back on the rolls. And in fact, in 2012, those who were purged were more likely than their doppelgangers, people exactly like them who were not purged, to turn out to vote in 2012. People get really pissed off when you start playing around with their voting rights. That said, we shouldn't probably go around and purge all of you from the voting rolls to make you even more excited about turning out to vote. Although I'm sure some social scientists would love to do that natural experiment, randomly assigning you to have your voting rights stripped. All right, I'm being just a little facetious. And then, of course, there are attacks on bloated voter rolls. I happen to defend Dr. Brenda Snipes last summer. She's at the center of all this controversy that I'll get to in just a second, because there was challenges from groups on the right saying that there were too many registered voters for the number of citizens who are voter-age population. In fact, the math that they were doing was completely erroneous, and the federal judge threw that challenge out and upheld the way that Broward was doing. A very important case because this group, the American Civil Rights Union, don't confuse that with the American Civil Liberties Union, led by our Christian Adams, was going around going after African-American jurisdictions and trying to get them to settle and purge voters from the rolls. And Broward stood up, and Brenda Snipes stood up, and I worked for the defendant interveners in that case, a coalition of voting rights groups. And then quickly, felon disenfranchisement. Again, when I hear claims on the left saying, well, this election would be completely different if we had 1.4 million registered voters who are now barred from registering, those being ex-felons who have served their time, you know, just put that aside. That's not what we had in 2018 election. We will have it in 2020 if it's implemented, and then it's a new ball game. But actually, we don't know how many of these 1.4 million will actually register to vote, will turn out to vote, and we certainly don't know how they're going to vote. And so the idea that this was going to somehow change the election is really fanciful. And when I hear that on the left, just kind of pipe down. Let's focus on the issues at hand as opposed to this hypothetical. Personally, I think it's a great victory for voting rights, and it will have some impact. I'm not certain in terms of what that impact will be, but when you're basically increasing the voter rolls potentially by 10%, that's historic. And Desmond Meade deserves a lot of credit. All right, restriction of the polls. I'm going to go very quickly through here. Voter ID laws, changing in polling place locations. We've had that go on in Florida. Changes to early voting. Of course, we had that massive change from 2008 to 2012 in which early voting was restricted from up to 14 days down to 8 days. And we had those massive lines in Miami-Dade where people were actually voting on Sunday, which had been eliminated by the legislature because they were in line by 7 p.m. on Saturday. And so they were in line for 6 or 7 hours and putting them into that Sunday category of actually early voting by virtue of their persistence. Ballot access, I was fortunate enough to be involved in the litigation that now requires when you went to vote in person or when you got your absentee ballot, you notice in Alachua County that there was what included in the ballot? Spanish. And that's because there's a little provision in the Voting Rights Act that hasn't really been challenged in terms of its enforcement that allows any Puerto Rican born and raised in Puerto Rico and educated in Spanish in public schools whose English is less than very good, speaks English less than very well as the actual language in the Voting Rights Act, has the right to Spanish language information as well as a ballot. And the judge in that case ruled there's not enough time to require the ballots, but at least when you go into the polls or in your absentee ballot, there should be a facsimile in Spanish. And so you all saw that at the polls when you went in. And that's a result of, again, a coalition challenging the fact that in 32 counties, there are a substantial number of Puerto Rican born who fall in this category, even though the supervisors there claimed, we don't know any Puerto Ricans who don't speak English. Well, they exist. And now we will have that going forward, and probably, depending on how the federal courts on appeal, this is the only part that the state of Florida appealed, Governor Scott appealed, was whether or not we should have ballot language in these jurisdictions that are not covered already by other parts of the Voting Rights Act. So if you're in Broward or Miami-Dade or Palm Beach or Orlando or Osceola, you have Spanish language in those jurisdictions. All right, so let's talk about the last week, because we certainly aren't having an election recap. We actually have ballots that are yet to be counted. Actually, we have ballots that are yet to be received that are going to be legally cast ballots. And I'll talk about that in a second. So this kind of language on the right is appalling, and it is rabble-rousing. It creates this ridiculous circus that reminds us back of 2000. Not every legally vote that was cast at the time had been counted yet, Marco Rubio. We should not talk about stopping the counting on election night, Donald Trump. We have people who are citizens of this country, including our military stationed overseas, but not exclusive to that, who haven't yet had their ballots come in and that are perfectly legal ballots. Talk about that in a second. We can talk about it with respect to the U.S. Senate race. So this is a really nice graph in terms of looking at the tightening, and this caused a lot of consternation among Republicans that how could this be? Election night has happened, and yet the results are getting tighter and tighter. Where are all these fraudulent ballots coming in from? Well, when you think about election administration, if you've got 1.4 million registered voters like a Broward County does, and you've got hundreds of thousands of absentee ballots that are coming in on the last weekend, Monday and Tuesday, election day, you don't get those all counted immediately. Those signatures have to be verified. They have to be vetted. If you have a problem with those signatures, voters have an opportunity to cure their absentee ballot signature. This all takes time. It takes the canvassing board to do that. Meanwhile, they've got 600 some odd precincts that they're worrying about getting the returns in on election night. And so there's no question that there are ballots that have been received that are legal coming from domestic voters up until 7 p.m. on election day that have not yet been counted. And as a result, when they're coming in from Democratic heavily rich counties like Broward County, there's no question. And you know what? This happens every election. We just don't notice it when the margins are so close. Every election, you have the exact same tightening. And usually, those who vote late in the game, those who get their absentee ballots in at the 11th hour, tend to be more Democratic and younger. Older voters get their absentee ballots in early. So we've seen this tightening, and we're down to this 12,000 some odd. That margin is actually going to change again, because more and more votes are going to be tabulated and counted. If we look at the undervote, this is another major area with respect to this recount that is happening. The automatic recount is going on. All that is feeding all these ballots through the machines again. And we might see some variation. It shouldn't be that much. But one of the big issues is this undervote of something of akin to about 25,000 ballots that if you look at the vote totals for Rick Scott and Bill Nelson, and you look at Bill Nelson's up here at the top, this 471, a lot of people were worrying what the heck was going on because Andrew Gillum had 480,000, 10,000 more total votes cast. And again, it could be that this is a racial thing where African Americans in Broward County were coming out for Andrew Gillum but not voting for Bill Nelson. I've actually done scatter plots across the 67 counties, and this is the only county where there's a huge outlier in terms of the drop-off between the gubernatorial race and the U.S. Senate race, where the U.S. Senate race has appreciably fewer Democrat votes for Nelson as opposed to the Democratic nominee Gillum for governor. Every other one kind of lines up there. Actually, Pinellas County is a little interesting. It's a little less for Gillum and a little more for Scott, as is Brevard County, a little more for Scott than Gillum. Why might that be? That's where Bill Nelson is from Brevard County. But this is a huge outlier. And this is going to be the key to the litigation, because the question is it a ballot error in terms of voters coming in and missing this race? And if so, is it the ballot error that is causing it, or is it a technological issue, a scanning issue of these ballots that come in? If you look at where those 24,000 or so ballots are, 25,000 ballots are that there's an undervote, it is in that dark pink area of Broward County, which is part of Congressional District 24. Now, why is Congressional District 24 important? Who's the member of Congress from? It's not Debbie. Debbie was actually on the ballot, and it's not Hastings. It's not Deutsch. You're right, it's going to be a Democrat. Frederica Wilson. Now, why don't you know Frederica Wilson's name? Well, because she's not even on the ballot. Florida law, if you don't have any challenger in the primary, if you have no general election, and if there's no write-in or third-party candidates, you're not on the ballot. She won her election in the August primary. She actually may have won in the filing when no one else challenged her. Honest to God. And as a result, this ballot, if you look at Broward, so this is one of my students' absentee ballots that came in the mail that she gave me. She's actually not in 24, so she's down here in District 22, all right? And that's Ted Deutsch's district. That's up in here. You will see that Rick Scott's and Bill Nelson's race is right here. Why is that important? Because this ballot comes down, it's English, Spanish, and Haitian Creole, And as a result, many English readers are going to see this, see a bunch of stuff they don't understand, and go right over here and vote either for DeSantis or Gillum and start going down. Now, when you have this kind of race, there's something that's going to bring your eye down here. Two things. This race, the U.S. Senate, as well as Ted Deutsch's nominal opposition. But at least it's going to bring your eye down there. The theory that it's voter error in terms of just skipping over with bad design of a ballot would be fine if it was consistent across all 5 congressional districts in Broward County. But the fact that it's limited to Frederica Wilson's portion of her district in Broward County raises the question that if this was taken off the ballot completely because she's not on it, did that cause this to drop a little and perhaps have the bubbles for the Senate race not align with the optical scanners? That at least is what the argument in part is being made by Mark Elias and the legal team representing Bill Nelson. We will not know that through a machine recount because the machine recount will tabulate these exact same and it should have that exact same difference. We'll only see this if there is a manual recount following this, if it's allowed, because of the time frame, it's an issue. And in that case, you will be able to see if people actually did bubble in Scott or Nelson. And in this heavily, heavily Democratic African American area, the votes are probably going to go 3-1 for Bill Nelson. All right? A couple last slides. So I've been running these numbers. If you've been following me on Election Smith, you know these numbers. But these are numbers that are being uploaded by the supervisor of elections every day. And I have access to them, and I run these queries that match these ballots that are coming in that are absentee to the October 1st voter file to get these numbers. And what these numbers basically tell you is that there are about 2.6 million vote-by-mail ballots that were cast. And of them, there are still 20,000 that were rejected because there was either no signature on the back. Younger voters were about 4 times more likely than, actually about 6 times more likely than older voters to screw up their absentee ballots. And about 10,000 that had some other type of error, mostly that your signature didn't match what's on file. And again, younger voters much more likely to screw up because you don't know what your signature looks like when you're 16 and you're registering in civics class thinking you're a great American. I'm pre-registering and you have a little heart over your eye that you've dotted, and now you're a big Gator and you've got a sophisticated, I'm signing my Gator 1 card and it doesn't look anything like your voter registration form, and you think you're signing your absentee ballot back in Broward County right, but in fact you have signed it your UF way, not your voter registration way. So it's a huge problem. These still may be changed. There could be affidavits that came in on time by Monday night at 5 p.m. that would change these either missing or mismatched signatures. There are also uncounted ballots out there. If you are living overseas, military or civilian, state law allows you to have your ballot either postmarked or dated by election day and then have up to 10 days to arrive. So I was a Fulbright scholar in Ghana in 2000. I was able to vote a special mail ballot. I put it into the diplomatic pouch. The pouch went with all the military, shipped over, and then the postmark would have been when it arrived in, I don't know, somewhere in Alexandria, Virginia, probably. That's why the date is very important in terms of there, because it's when you dated the absentee ballot, if you did that, or if you're overseas and you faxed your ballot in. You're actually allowed to fax your ballot in with an affidavit if you're overseas. So there are ballots that are still coming in that have been mailed and haven't made it to the through the Postal Service to the supervisors. So it's unconscionable to be thinking that we're going to be having citizens, including our military overseas, not have their ballots counted when they're doing absolutely the right thing under state law. It raises, however, big questions. So the P here is the almost 20,000 ballots, absentee ballots that as of yesterday morning had been mailed out that had not yet been received. So we're talking almost 20,000 potential ballots. Now, not all those are going to come in. Not everyone's going to mail them back. But they could be sitting in Opelika, U.S. Postal Service, waiting to be brought there. They're not all going to be rejected because these, if they're overseas, it's just arriving by 10 days after, so that's November 16th. All right? And yet we're supposed to have the recount done before ballots are even legally allowed to arrive. Again, there's just some inconsistencies, and this is going to be part of the legal challenge. How is it possible that we allow certain parts of our citizens to have their ballots come in 10 days after Election Day, but those that come in immediately after election, like the 7,000 ballots that were received on the 7th, 8th, and 9th, these are, again, absentee ballots, that were rejected because of error. Why? Because presumably they came in too late because they were domestic. Why should you have your ballot rejected because the Postal Service couldn't get there, or because there was a mail bombing scare and Postal Service was shut down in South Florida? These are the arguments that are going to be made in federal court tomorrow up in Tallahassee, I would imagine, by the legal team about unequal treatment under the law. That's a 14th Amendment claim, and I'm sure there are other claims. All right? So we're talking about a lot of ballots that haven't been done there. I want to just finish with thinking about Florida. Florida had this historic restoration of voter rights pass, and there's a lot to be said about this. But I want to caution, because with this law passing, we have to put it in perspective of what's been going on in Florida. Unlike all those other lists of red tide voter suppression restrictions on voting, Florida has, since 2013, actually gone the other direction. Our Republican legislature has actually expanded the number of voter IDs that you can use. We're up to, 12 different IDs you can use, including your student ID, including your retirement community ID. Georgia, you got to have a state-issued ID. Alabama, right? We have no excuse absentee voting. You don't have to be gone in order to ask for an absentee ballot. You do in Alabama. You got to swear under oath that you are not going to be in your county in order to get one. And that's why less than 1% of votes cast in Alabama are vote by mail. They don't have early voting. We have up to 2 weeks of early voting. Again, the Republican legislature learned after the debacle in 2012 and changed the law in 2013, but it was the Republican legislature and Republican governor that did all these things. We have online voter registration. A lot of states don't have that. So the Republican legislature, despite the larger narrative here in Florida, has actually expanded the opportunities relative to a lot of Republican legislatures elsewhere. What I would submit is the passage of Amendment 4 may change that. Why? Because when you're excluding 1.4 million registered voters from even registering, it might change the balance of the equation even more. And so what I would caution is watch out for what the legislature is going to be doing moving forward in terms of changing some of those expansions of voter rights, ironically because of the expansion of ex-felons now having the right to vote. So I'll leave you with, my projection, which was slightly off, but within the margin of error, so I will give you that. Anything I said tonight was probably within the margin of error. And I worked very hard with Matt Barretto, who was running these surveys, nightly surveys. None of it was public, but before the election, at 7 p.m., we projected this, and it was based on his survey data, which, again, about who knows what the response rate was, but we weighted it using my data, and we knew that there was going to be heavy Republican turnout on Election Day. We just underestimated how heavy that Republican turnout. I didn't think that we were going to have 85% turnout among Republicans in Sumter County. So I'll leave you with this flashback, and I think it's probably the appropriate one we should have here now 18 years later. So thank you.
Thank you so much to both of you. And now we have time for a few questions. We'll take 10 to 15 minutes. So be sure we're doing questions. And just come ahead and line up.
Dr. MacManus mentioned in her points that she was making that there's growing concern and disbelief among voters that voting is fair and run properly. And the question I'd like to ask is sort of what we're seeing right now and have been seeing this week. Our senator, Rubio, even blasted the Arizona election as being a fraud. That Scott has gone on and on about this, and President Trump has also gone into this. So is this setting up and projecting forward to future elections in Florida and a conscious effort, do you think, by Republican political leaders, Scott, Trump, Rubio, to further cast doubt on the validity and accuracy of the election, to promote that view among voters? Thank you.
Okay. I think there's mixed opinions about that. For one thing, you could make the argument that it is a disservice, and I think a lot of people would agree with that, particularly if you're a Democrat. If you're a Republican, you're looking at it and you're saying, if we don't keep the word fraud alive, the Democrats will just keep loosening things and losing control over ballots, etc. I do want to make the point that a lot of people forget, because you're not from South Florida. We have actually had a major election overturned because of vote-by-mail fraud in Florida. It was a mayor's race in the city of Miami not that long ago. And we also had, even more recently, a congressional aide go to prison for massive fraud in vote-by-mail, absentee ballots. We know across the country that this is the problem area. If there's going to be fraud, it's usually there. And so you can see that, in a way, you could argue that Republicans don't want people to lose sight of it. And there has been fraud already in Florida this time. It's the same one we have every year. People who are registered in more than one state get caught voting in the second state, which is ours. It's not a lot of people, but when it happens, it does cause people to be angry about it. I just say we're in the frenzy right now where the stakes are high, the emotions are high. But I just ask people, in a way, to think about this. When people say, well, why do we have these problems? When you have people and you have equipment, both are not perfect. The question is, are they intentionally bad, or is it an accident? And I think that's kind of what the question is right now with Broward County. Was the actions of the supervisor unintentional but just mismanagement, or was it intentional? So far we haven't seen that latter, but it's the way that it's being cast.
Good evening. Thank you so much for great presentations. I think anybody who was on campus during early vote here saw the excitement level and the amazing participation of not just students, but also faculty and staff and other people who work on the campus. It was such a robust turnout. But if you could clarify for me, my understanding is that what the judge did in allowing on-campus early voting was just an injunction. It was just for this election cycle. Am I understanding that? Or is this going to now absolutely be the law of the land in Florida?
No, so the litigation was challenging a directive by the Secretary of State, actually coming out of Gainesville, about having a local mayoral race, city commission race, having early voting. And he said no, it contravenes what the legislature wanted to do. The federal judge overturned that, but the issue is, do local supervisors or universities have to do so? No, it is up to them. And so having our supervisor election, Kim Barton, I was the expert in that lawsuit. We had to sue Kim Barton in order to get it in federal court with the Tallahassee Secretary of State. We also know that Kim Barton was favorable of having it on campus. But we had to convince her, as well as the University of Florida, to be able to make it happen. And once that happened, it created pressure on other universities. Most of them adopted it, of the state universities, including a couple, Miami-Dade College also did. But it's not set in stone. It's basically, this is an experiment. And if we didn't have robust turnout here, which we did, it was the third highest turnout of any of the 6 early voting, there was no guarantee of having it in the future. Whether or not it happened in the other counties that offered it, and whether or not they're going to use it in 2020 is going to be up to the supervisor, it's going to be up to the finances, and it's going to be up ultimately to the universities of saying whether or not they want to have it.
An interesting thing happened that I saw in one newspaper, I forget where it was in this state, where some senior homes are now saying if you're going to have places for the young people to make it convenient, then have them in the senior homes. Yep. At a time when everyone's trying to go to reduce the number of voting sites so that you can vote regardless of where you live, you can vote at a centralized voting precinct. But it looks like we might be headed back towards everybody's got to have a voting precinct again, which honestly, it's getting very difficult to staff poll workers. Mm-hmm. Poll workers have to be very much better trained these days for legalities and a lot of other reasons. And it's getting increasingly difficult to find venues that will meet federal requirements as to accessibility for various kinds of individuals. So, the idea that you can have one everywhere, we can't go back there again. But I love the fact that you had competition among the universities in Florida as to who could get the biggest turnout. You all won.
We did.
Where I was, USF was desperately trying to beat UCF, but we didn't do it. But anyway, it was a great thing for everybody involved.
Right.
Dr. Smith, you made a very good point that the Florida legislature has done us a lot of favors in approaching voter integrity. But one of the ones which I think would be most consequential is the ability to use clear audit. In our congressional district, only Putnam County uses that. And as of Thursday night last week, they had completed 100% audit of all races on the ballot. 55 of our SOEs have not adopted it, and I consider that they are not interested in our confidence in their integrity. And the one least interested, I suspect, is Brenda Snipes, given her destruction of ballots in the 2016 23rd Congressional District race between DWS and Tim Canova, which they have topped by saying Tim Canova only got 4% of the vote this year, which leaves it open to validation by affidavit of voters, which I hope proceeds.
Yeah, you raise a lot of good points. We have a very decentralized system with respect to how audits are going to go. We have a very decentralized system with respect to the decisions on the technologies to be adopted, the vendors to be used. We actually still have 3 of the 67 counties that use their own software or their own developer, as opposed to all the rest being part of the VR systems network. I'm ambivalent on whether it's good or bad to have an outside vendor actually running our elections. But the case is very true what you say in terms of why some of the auditing is taking longer in certain counties. Some of that has to do with the appropriations that county governments are giving to the supervisor of elections. Other states will have a supervisor of election that has an independent authority with respect to its budget. We don't have that here. Our supervisor of elections have been systematically starved by the state, even though they have received federal dollars coming through them that could have been used, as opposed to putting the money this time around in security of hacking, which again, it's admirable. There's a lot of infrastructure that the counties are dependent on their county supervisors to be able to provide infrastructure. So I'm not going to comment on the 4% for Canova. I think he ran his course, and I think 4% is probably pretty accurate. But I'm not going to go there. I haven't looked at the data.
There's something else in terms of, if you look at Palm Beach and Broward, one of the problems that they're having in Palm Beach in particular is some of the scanning equipment is old and it's not loading as fast. And here is a generic problem that's not just limited to Florida. We're seeing an election administration across the country, and that is a lot of times when you have supervisor of elections, particularly that are elected and are more politically oriented, they don't know very much about IT. And they don't know when the IT people are not doing the job that they need to do. And I seriously believe that the good news for all of us is having the mess right now, with the legislative session starting in January, I guarantee you that the Florida State Association of Supervisors of Elections will get together and have a very good legislative proposal to put forward to correct some of these problems. And that we know from the 2000 debacle, that was the time when we saw the greatest bipartisanship and the quickest reaction and the most extensive election improvements was right after that. So a lot of people are hopeful that that's what will happen this next January when the legislature meets.
I did want to connect the clear audit to the specific point that you could do the Frederica Wilson thing because it's a whole ballot scam.
Right, right, and it's an interesting question on whether or not it's going to be the technology or whether it was simply ballot design, which if it's ballot design, it's going to be hard to make that argument to turn those votes.
So first of all, thank you very much to both of you for coming out tonight and explaining what happened this election. What I was wondering is, Dr. MacManus commented on these shifting demographics over time, especially with the Gen Zs and upcoming generations are more and more ethnically diverse. What's going to be happening more and more, because of these demographics typically vote Democratic, I think the Republicans have a long-term problem and the Democrats have a long-term advantage. While at the same time, the Democrats have a short-term problem in finding that base and uniting it under something. So what do you believe is going to be happening electorally and politically in Washington moving forward between the two parties, and especially finding their new bases?
Chaos.
Yeah, it is. I mean, we're seeing that in places like Texas and in Georgia right now. I mentioned this, and this is a nice opportunity to come back. Florida is different because Florida has, as Dr. Colburn has documented in his work, and you've got several great books. Florida Megatrends is just a wonderful, popularized type of book that I think is really important with respect to the flow of white, older, more conservatives coming from the Midwest down to retire in Florida. And you know what? They are active in their home state. They register to vote when they get their driver's license, or even before then. They turn out to vote in massive numbers, and they vote Republican disproportionate to Democrat. And when you combine all that, it doesn't matter what your demographic shift is. In that sense, demography is not destiny, because it's being offset by not a shifting generational that other states are going through. I grew up in Pennsylvania. Old folks don't move to Pennsylvania. All right? Old folks die, and they're replaced by younger, more diverse people.
That's what we're seeing here, too.
And we're seeing a little of that, but it's the fact that 85% of Republicans turned out to vote in Sumter County, the heart of the villages. When they're not going to the doctors and dealing with their syphilis, they're turning out to vote. And they're voting Republican. All right? And that isn't going to change. People are still going to be moving to Sumter County. They're going to keep expanding that, and they're going to keep voting Republican. And I am not
necessarily people moving here. You already seen a shift, like in Sarasota County. Anyone from Sarasota? Sarasota used to be solidly Republican. Now a Democrat just got elected to the legislature. Look at Volusia County. So you can't really make that argument.
Well, I think it's still there more than other states. I mean, again, Sarasota County, I actually thought there was a chance for the 15th Congressional District to go blue because of those changing demographics, especially not on the coast but inland in Sarasota and Manatee and Polk County, where there is a demographic shift. The fact of the matter is we still have, 1,000 people a day coming down to Florida from up north. They're not all Republicans, but they all vote. And I'll give you one last statistic. I don't know the final numbers because I won't know the demographics of Election Day voters until January. But going into Election Day, with all the vaunted early voting in person, all the absentee voting, 18 to 29-year-olds make up 17% of the electorate. At that time, they made up 8% of those who had turned out. those 65 to 104 made up 27% of the electorate. They made up 46% of those who turned out to vote. Now, those numbers will shift and shrink in the opposite directions with Election Day because older folks vote early, but they're not going to nearly compensate. We're not going to be nearly 17% of the electorate being 18 to 29-year-olds, even though they make up that percentage of registered voters.
Thank you.
We'll have two more questions, and then we'll end.
So my question does lean a little bit on the previous answer you gave, but it's more on just the divide of the rural versus urban. You mentioned inland in the sense that it's still, we're seeing the demographic change not as much as we would expect. Would you think that the effects should be monitored even more, even though it's harder to poll them, as you mentioned? Should it still be taken into consideration for 2020?
You want to take the urban-rural split? The pollster I work with, Matt Barretto, who does Latino decisions, in his text when we saw the results coming in, and that even though we waited knowing that Election Day voter is going to be much more Republican because of the past election numbers that I was looking at, he said, damn those small, rural, conservative counties, because they turn out to vote. And they turn out to vote on Election Day largely because there aren't going to be lines. They're in these small precincts.
A lot of it's civic duty and patriotism.
A lot of it's the civic duty, and Trump certainly trumped that up going into Election Day. Remember, in 2016, Hillary Clinton was up by over 300,000 votes going into 200,000 votes going into Election Day. Trump won Election Day by about 300,000 votes and won by that 115,000 difference. So there's something about that civic duty, the civic pride. I was very skeptical about the walkout among high school students. You walk out of your high school, you got to get to your local precinct. It's not going next door to the convention center that had early voting the previous 2 weeks. You actually have to go and know where your Election Day polling place is. And again, I'm not blaming this election on younger voters. I'm not blaming it on Puerto Ricans who didn't turn out to vote after the aftermath. I'm not blaming it on. All we can say is that Republicans know how to turn out on Election Day.
One thing that we haven't talked about is the hurricane. The hurricane really did, the Republican margin would have been even bigger. But Bay County, Panama City, only had 50% turnout. And it's a huge number of Republicans, and they really got hammered by the hurricane. And now they have a problem because they accepted some vote by mails via emails. So, but anyway, I was just saying, the Republican margin would have been bigger.
I mean, you're right. There's no question that the devastation of Hurricane Michael across those 8 counties. And my hat is off, again, to the supervisor of elections and to Secretary Detzner in terms of providing these accommodations to allow vote by mail ballots to go out by email domestically, to be able to, they had to come back regular. They couldn't be faxed or emailed back, but they made provisions to have early voting centers extend through that final Sunday and Monday to accommodate. I think you're probably right. Had those voters been able to get their margins up, that the gap today would be a little bigger.
Hi, how you guys doing? So first of all, thank you for the speech, really engaging. So my question, I'm from Broward County, went to Stoneman Douglas, talked a lot about everything that happened there, obviously. So my question, you had a lot of focus and kind of support for Brenda Snipes throughout your portion, and my question is kind of, do you think that the lack of the total number of votes left to count and all that that's going on in Broward, and I think it's Miami-Dade if I'm correct, is a prioritization of what's going on? Because the hurricane, like the counties that were damaged by the hurricane, were able to get all those votes counted, but then we have, I mean, I don't say his name publicly, I don't think it should be advertised, but he was able to vote. I mean, he's not really human, so like, to me, he shouldn't be able to vote at all. Right. You know what I mean? Right. So that's my question to you. Like, I think that's a weird prioritization that we have him, whatever you want to call, voting, or registering at least, and then not having that.
Yeah, I mean, you raise good questions. We have capacity issues in our larger counties. I mean, Duval County, which does things pretty well up in the Jacksonville area, had 3 machines fail yesterday as they were doing their recount. They're half the size of Broward. They've got more resources per capita than Broward. So these are issues that are political issues ultimately in terms of whether or not the counties and their boards and their mayors are going to direct appropriate resources. It's a political question whether the state is going to be providing those resources. Brenda Snipes was appointed by Governor Jeb Bush.
Yeah.
She's been there a long time. She's she's a doctor for a reason. She's not incompetent. Whether or not you have other issues going on, it's not her fault when the mail isn't delivering absentee ballots by Election Day, even though we know people here, everyone in this room will know someone who requested an absentee ballot, got that absentee ballot, mailed it in, and it took 2 weeks and isn't being counted. That's not the supervisor's problem. That's a mail delivery issue. When you're dealing with getting the absentee ballots out in a timely manner, that falls on the supervisor. And if there's evidence of that being a problem, we should look into it. If it's a question of absentee ballots that are sitting in a warehouse in the supervisor's office that haven't been counted because they're dealing with the 600 precincts and getting the election night results in, that to me is not an issue. That happens in every county. It's a question of getting the priority. You have a 3-member canvassing board to be able to count those votes and make sure that the valid ones are accepted because the signature matches. I don't want them all processed election night if the signatures don't match, if there's a different person who's been sending it in. We want to have due process. Sometimes that can't be done, the capacity isn't there on election day when you have 100-some thousand vote by mail ballots coming in by 7 p.m. and you have 600 returns coming in from precincts. There's a capacity issue. Every other election and every county, it's done over time. And that's why the results change. It's because the election was so close that we now are somehow appalled by the way spaghetti and how I guess sausage is made. And we look at how sausage is made and are saying, my God, this shouldn't happen. But in fact, it happens every election. We're just not looking at it.
There is also an issue, though. She was elected 4 times by Broward County voters. And one of the things that's very interesting that I think we might see revisited, except we just passed a constitutional amendment that would make it impossible, but for years the Florida State Association of Supervisors of Elections, the supervisors themselves were begging to be nonpartisan. But, of course, you all passed amendment, whichever one, that made all constitutional, 10, made all constitutional officers now have to be elected, because in Miami, which has a very good supervisor and is being compared to being very competent compared to Brenda Snipes, she is appointed, but now she'll have to be elected. But anyway, the whole idea that people should have to vote on a partisan label to be a supervisor when they have to run, next year they'll be running in the 2020 election, puts a lot of pressure on them. Reflected in what you were showing with the secretaries of state that were running for these big positions.
Yep.
Thank you so much for this wonderfully enlightening program. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Gail, and of course, Dr. Colburn. I even come up here, being a Seminole for the Gators because of you too. So thank you not really. I love them, but you all too. But what a pleasure. And you all have a real wonderful thing. The Bob Graham Center, people from all over the state, my students at USF love to come to the Issues Forum here. Good job to each of you. You're not just great professionals, you're good friends. Thank you. We got through it. Is this your